Good evening, everyone on this side of the Pacific, and good morning for people on the other side of the Pacific. In China, this is the New Year's Day, and in the US, this is New Year's Eve. As you can see, what I'm wearing fits the occasion. When Fudan and I decided the timing of this webinar, I didn't realize, it is the Chinese New Year's Eve here. But as I reflect on that, this is the time to celebrate. So tonight, we're actually celebrating the enduring contribution by a very important ethnic group here in the United States. At the same time, beyond celebration, we also need to reflect on, the bamboo ceilings that we're confronting, the stereotype, discrimination that Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, AAPI community are now all confronting. So this is both a time of celebration and deliberation. So for tonight, we have two speakers. The first one is Fudan Ho. Fudan is actually born here in the United States, but spent his first 5 years in China. So he's a typical second generation Chinese American. Hypatia, obviously, many of you know him. He's legend. He is the founding president of United Chinese Americans. He's fighting on behalf of many Chinese Americans because they have encountered a lot of harassment, a lot of discrimination, and racial profiling. So he will make a comment after Fudan talks about the landmark report conducted by Committee of 100. After that, we will open the webinar to all the audience. And for your questions to be answered, please either send your questions to the chat, which I will monitor, or alternatively, you can also post your questions to the Q&A. We may answer, if your questions goes there, we may answer them live online, or we may get the two speakers to address them after their remarks. So without further ado, Fudan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yahweh, and thank you to all who are able to share a bit of their time on this festivities, on this time of Lunar New Year, to join us for this conversation. And I want to thank all the co-sponsoring organizations, and I'm very grateful to be able to share this platform with our colleagues, Hypatia at the United Chinese Americans. And I think in these times now, more than ever, our community really needs to come together, not just to celebrate, but also find ways to address some of the challenges, including many of the rise of attacks and the races and bigotry on our seniors and the most vulnerable in our community. And so, yeah, I wanted to start off and share a little bit about tonight. I'll be going over some of the origins, how we came about to create this study. I'll go over some of the research findings, the key takeaways, calls for action for our community, and I'll also provide some links to other resources where you can find the report along with some other materials. And so this week, as we celebrate the Lunar New Year, I'm happy to announce that we have launched the project on our public site, and you can find it here. My colleague Lloyd will also post it in the chat. And here you can find our full report along with 7 pillar reports dedicated to different sectors of contributions, including public service, arts and culture, and etc. And I just also want to acknowledge that as we're coming together today during this time of celebration, there's also many challenges and there's a lot of negativity that needs to be acknowledged. And that stems from all the things happening around COVID to just how Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, we all know this, and many of you may resonate with this, how we're considered the perpetual foreigner and as the other. Oftentimes we feel that we have to prove our American worth quote unquote. And so the study itself, this was originated before the COVID, before the months and rise of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment. This was created because we wanted to dispel the notion that Chinese Americans have to prove their Americanness. We wanted to show through evidence-based, through facts and data, that Chinese Americans have contributed greatly and they're just as American as anybody else. Throughout this conversation, I will cover many things that folks here already know about, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, the contributions of railroad workers, but the hopes of this study is to combine all those elements together, how we've contributed in arts and culture, in science technology, and in many other platforms. And we would love to hear your feedback, your comments. If you have questions, please enter it into the Q&A section. And so our community is not at all a monolith. When it comes to Chinese Americans, we are representing about 5.3 million across the population, with about 3.9 Chinese Americans who are US citizens. While the majority of Chinese Americans are doing well and they have a bachelor's degree, there's still many, 1 out of 5, who do not speak proficient English. When it comes to income, while our community is doing fairly well, there's still many, as a matter of fact, 35% who are below the national median. And so what that looks like in areas like New York City and other cities and across the country is Chinese Americans, there's a huge disparity between who's at the top and who's at the bottom. And so oftentimes our community goes very unrecognized, and we are seen very as invisible in terms of our needs when it comes to access to social services, to the right support, mental health resources, and things that are in the appropriate language and the cultural competent ways that Chinese Americans can access these resources. When it comes to our ethnic backgrounds and where we come from, we also make up a wide variety and across different generations. And Chinese Americans, they actually identify with some with multiple races as well. And this really attests to the different waves of immigration of Chinese Americans. Across the American landscape, we represent, most of the Chinese Americans are in areas like San Francisco, in LA, and New York City, but there's also growing population in areas like Texas, like in Washington, and in areas like Chicago, in Illinois, and many other states. And so the story of Chinese Americans cannot really be told without sharing a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And it's the first and only federal legislation that had excluded and explicitly denied the immigration of a single nationality. And so with that, as the Chinese Exclusion Act was implemented, Chinese Americans were limited in employment options. They had very little political power. And so with that, you see the creation of local Chinatowns in the Bay Area in New York City, where they really had to rely on each other. And they also had to venture out into industries that they had to be self-starters in. You see this in restaurants, in laundromats, et cetera. I'll be talking a little bit about that area of entrepreneurship in a little bit. Beyond the Exclusion Act, there's also other areas of discrimination and actual violent acts committed against the Chinese American community. For example, in the Rock Springs Massacre, in the 1871 massacre in LA, in the Seattle riots. These are just a couple of cases where Chinese Americans faced extreme discrimination. As a matter of fact, as we're talking about the pandemic and Chinese Americans seen as carriers of the disease, back in 1901, California governor, he actually labeled Chinese Americans as carriers of the bubonic plague when there was an outbreak in San Francisco. And like I said, there's repetitions in history, and we're seeing it today with COVID, and we really need to find ways to learn from it and rise above it. Even with the Chinese Exclusion Act repealed, back in 1905, there were only, actually 1943, there were only 105 Chinese Americans allowed to immigrate here per year. And so with that, it really impacted the immigration flows to the United States and for better opportunities. So with this project, I'll be talking about three main pillars on how we did this study: how we built an economic powerhouse, how we strengthened national institutions, and how we enriched the social and cultural fabric of the country. With that, I'll be touching on different domains, including arts and culture, civil rights, education, and more. So Chinese Americans, they contribute to a lot of things that we experience and really need on a day-to-day basis. They're chefs, they're taxi drivers, and they're in the tech sector, helping with creating software. And together we contribute about 304 billion in terms of consumer spending, and about 3 million jobs are supported because of that. Our workforce represents about 2.3 Chinese Americans, and back, just reiterating the theme of entrepreneurship, we create about $240 billion in revenue and support 1.3 million jobs. But even with that, as Yahweh had pointed out, there's still a lot of hardships along the way, as Chinese Americans advancing up the career ladder see themselves facing what is called the bamboo ceiling in terms of executive leadership positions. And so really perpetuates that stereotype that Chinese Americans are good workers, but not good leaders. Again, this is an area that many folks know about, how Chinese Americans have contributed to the creation and the final product of the Transcontinental Railroad. And about 90% of the workforce there was represented by Chinese Americans. And that impacts what we use today on a daily basis. About $1.3 billion worth of freight each year is used on those rails. Beyond pushing frontiers across the coast, Chinese Americans have also been at the forefront in pushing innovation frontiers. And 15% of Chinese Americans are employed in STEM-related occupations, in life science and computer science, etc. 9 Fortune 500 companies were founded by Chinese Americans. And there's some folks that you know today, like Eric Yuan, who founded Zoom. There's Jerry Yang with Yahoo, Steve Chen, co-founder of YouTube. I also want to acknowledge, and it was something that we celebrated today, was the commemoration of also C100 founder Chen Shengbu, who was a trailblazer in nuclear physics. Next, I'll be talking about how Chinese Americans have helped strengthen our American institutions. This includes important cases in civil rights, helping to protect national security in serving our country, and contributing to public service. And so just last year in December, we also had a commemoration and award ceremony for the Chinese Americans who served in the military during World War II. And keep in mind, this was in 1940s. That was during the time as the Chinese Exclusion Act was going to be repealed. So Chinese Americans were willing to serve their country even with all these legislative and discriminatory policies in place. I also want to point out that during that time, folks like Hazel Ying Lee and Maggie G were great women who also served in the military, contributing to the country. So there's been several cases that Chinese Americans have come together to really rally around. And so I will be talking about 2 significant cases today, many of which you already have heard about. So one is United States versus Wong Kim Ark, which is a story of someone who was traveling back from China back to the United States. And upon arrival, he was denied re-entry. But Wong Kim Ark, he didn't just accept that. He continued to fight and really ask for justice, taking his case all the way up to the Supreme Court and really establishing birthright citizenship, which we now know and really are privileged to have nowadays. I myself, second generation Chinese Americans, would not be here without birthright citizenship. I also want to point out Yikwell versus Hopkins, another case that initially Chinese Americans faced some discrimination with. During that time in San Francisco, laundromats were required to get permits if they were wooden storefronts. And so even though about 90% of the laundromats were Chinese owned, 0 Chinese American laundromats were given permits at the time. And so with that case, what it found was that even if something was applied pretty equally on the surface, if it's discriminatory in practice, then it's found unjust. I also want to point out that with these cases, they were really credited to the efforts of mutual aid organizations, the 6 companies, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Associations, that really banded together to support each other during times of great need, something that we really are in need of today and hope to really emulate. In terms of public policy and politics, Chinese Americans have seen an increase in participation, and between 2009 and 2018, their roles in public administration grew by nearly 70%. And so many of us know folks like Grace Meng, Judy Chu, and Gary Locke, Stephen Chu, and even recent presidential candidate Andrew Yang. And so that is actually not the first Asian American and Chinese American to run for that office. It is actually Senator Hiram Fong from Hawaii. But speaking of Andrew Yang and just Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in politics and in public service, there's still a huge gap that we are in need of today in terms of representation. With the case of Andrew Yang, there was many times where the media didn't portray him in a most fair or objective way. In terms of representation, Chinese Americans are also having to fight for a seat at the table and still experience some discrimination. With Grace Meng, as many of you know, her office during COVID, she had received many threats as well in terms of racist remarks and different slurs. So I want to just point out that even though there's been growth, there's still a lot of challenges along the way. Chinese Americans in the grassroots level have also been involved in several movements related to the Third World liberation in terms of advocating for the proper incorporation of Asian American studies at areas like San Francisco State University. I also wanted just to take this time to acknowledge the work of activist, historian, and photographer Corky Lee, who recently passed away, and we really credited his work and his photos included in the slide. And just documenting that part of history and sharing that is so powerful. And that's why we need studies like this to really remember and learn from it, and also just celebrate some of the contributions across different areas of society. When it comes to mobilizing for justice, we definitely need to come together as we have done in history. When it came to injustice, we know of the major case of Vincent Chin, who was wrongfully murdered by 2 auto workers in Detroit who had mistaken him to be Japanese. And through that, there was a huge mobilization and energy surrounding Vincent Chin through folks like Helen Zia and through the powerful works of his mother to advocate for justice, to demand proper treatment, and really just to honor his name. When it comes to Chinese Americans in culture and media, we have made great strides, even though we represent 1.2% of the population. There's many folks nowadays in fashion design, like Philip Lim, and also in architecture, folks like Maya Lin, Calvin Tsao. And even though there's been great strides, I think we want to celebrate that, but also acknowledge how difficult it was to get to where we are today. I mean, just a couple of years ago, we were watching movies like Crazy Rich Asians and Their Farewell. And even though Chinese Americans have been here for so long, only until these recent years have we only seen these stories that properly or justly portray our stories. And so we are, seeing the need for more representation across arts and culture. Across public health breakthroughs, Chinese Americans have been on the forefront for even with COVID and also in scientific discovery for vaccines, et cetera. Chinese Americans make about 7% of biological and medical and other life scientists in the US, which is more than 5 times their share of the US population. We know of folks like Dr. David Ho, who was instrumental in finding a treatment for HIV during the 1990s called the antiretroviral therapy, which impacted about 2.5 million folks around the world. We also know of Dr. Chang, who also contributed through the advancement of IVF, which impacted 8 million folks around the world. And so during this presentation, I mentioned that while we have many things to celebrate, there's also a lot of challenges along the way. In terms of language access, in terms of moving up on the socioeconomic ladder, there's still a lot of great challenges there, as Chinese Americans across the country are still in need of access to different resources, social services, but meanwhile, they are also in need of participation in our local day-to-day. In terms of voter turnout, even though in Georgia, we've seen great turnout in terms of flipping the Senate, we still are in need of more representation in more local and more statewide races. And so we hope that Chinese Americans can continue to turn out and be able to participate in these civics. In terms of leadership positions, like I mentioned, Chinese Americans still face somewhat of a bamboo ceiling. Even though they represent about 3% of professionals, it dwindles down when you get up to the executive positions. Going back to the theme that Chinese Americans are good workers, but they're not good leaders. What we want to do is push against that. And lastly, in the past week, within the past year, the rise of anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiment is something that we directly need to address and stand up against. It's when you're including and being more friendly towards immigrants, something that the country was built out of, do we really allow for folks to be able to contribute a lot more? So with this presentation, here are some takeaways just for folks to really think about, that Chinese Americans, we've made all these contributions, and despite all the discriminatory and these systemic racist policies that we have in place, Chinese Americans have also been able to contribute more as the country opened up, as we see when they repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, being able to contribute more through entrepreneurship and different sectors and areas. And so with all this, there's still a lot of potential, and Chinese Americans have a lot more to offer in terms of all these different sectors, in arts, in culture, in the public sector, and leadership. And these are things that we need to encourage more of and advocate for, find partners and allies to really stand together to educate folks about this rich history and how more we can really be. Some calls to action for today for the folks in the crowd, you can type that into the chat or into the Q&A, is really how do we go about, as a community that's so diverse, different generations, different political beliefs, to really find ways to just come together to rise against this anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment. Can we do it? I believe we can. How do we go about breaking down the model minority myth that, for folks who think that Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are someone, they're okay, they don't need help? How do we really dispel that to show that there's a huge need of folks within the community that are not okay? Yeah, and how do we go about breaking down the bamboo ceiling? How do we encourage folks to really empower leadership across the community? And how do we come together, join in statements, partner together with non-Asian allies? How do we, now we can't just really advocate into a vacuum and into our own little silos, but we need folks and partners to stand together with us. If you want to see more about this report, I encourage you to check out the website, and my colleague Lloyd will post it again. This presentation was not meant to capture everything in the report, but it's more so just a quick summary of some of the key findings and to give a little bit more context, just where we are and where we could be. And so with that, I thank you for your time and appreciate any questions.
Before we're going to ask Futon and Haipei to address the questions, Haipei will offer some remarks on the report, and Haipei, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Yawei. Thank you for your overly generous comments on what we have been doing here. Very excited the opportunity to say this on the eve of Lunar Chinese New Year. This is nothing is more symbolic for this evening about what we're talking about here. I think I'll have a quick comments on this. Not trying to correct what C100 study has done, but just to give you a footnote. 2018 census data already put the Chinese American population at 5.4 something million Chinese Americans. And I'm pretty sure when the census data comes out of 2020 in a few more months, it will be somewhere close to 6 million. So, which is a good thing, right? I often say that I came to United States in '87, and there were only 1.2 million Chinese Americans. Now we have almost 5 times more in my own last 30 years. Number speaks powerfully in the democracy, both for its votes and for its social dynamics it can bring to a society. So just by looking at this number, we are a very, very hopeful and promising society. If you would believe in the census data, their prediction is in 25 years, there will be about 9 million Chinese Americans in this country. So very soon will be like there will be close to 2% of American population are Chinese Americans. With that, I think we all need to think a little bit harder and deeper. What we should do more, building on what Fulton has just gave the presentation, that study of the huge progress Chinese American has made. I want to point out one thing here. Now, when you talk about Chinese American society's achievement or problems, there is this new kind of, I would call it a little bit a fad that you cannot talk about Chinese American or Asian Americans' achievements very much. It is a so-called anti-model minority. Now, I do agree that we should not just to simply say we are a model minority in this country, but I'm also at the same time against saying or suggesting or having a solid data suggesting that Asian Americans and among them Chinese Americans have been doing pretty well and have been progress in many fronts, including our joint household income, which is way higher than the national average. So there is a tendency, I think we need to have a very fine balance. There is this political correctness going on now among the Asian American activist community and on certain academic circles that almost prohibit you from speaking up on a great achievement of Asian Americans. Because saying that, be afraid, saying that, well, it's a good sensitivity, I have to say that, but not to carry to too much of an extreme extent. The fear is that if we say too much of the Asian American achievements or to the extent of being a model minority, then we will alienate our relationship with Latinos and the Black communities. I appreciate that sensitivity. However, I do think that to find out why Asian Americans do well in this society also may provide some insight on where our problem comes from as a whole society and what solution we may provide from the Asian American or Chinese American experience. Now, at the very beginning, Yawei has mentioned that on this eve of Lunar New Year, our society today are actually, many of you may be aware, there were, up until a few days ago, three GoFundMe fundraisers to help raise money for the 3 Chinese American professors in deep legal troubles. We all know where that comes from. It's primarily from the China Initiative of Justice Department. I want to say this to everybody here, just put this in a proper perspective. Photon also mentioned that there are several milestone legal achievements in the past by the Chinese American community. If to a large extent, you can really view the Chinese American history as a history of a constant legal fight, legal battles in this country through our court. Our legal experience in this country historically has actually helped deeply define what America stands for. It is a huge achievement for a tiny, tiny minority and a very much depressed or oppressed minority living on the margins that has contributed so much to American society on the legal front. And I hope that today's continuing fight in our court about Chinese American scientists could be one more step in that right direction, that no people should be racially profiled, that government overreach should be stopped, that any people and any society, every individual should be equal, truly in the eyes of laws. These are very exciting time, and we're going to see more of this, not less, in this coming decade. I think this troublesome situation we find ourselves, which is largely derived from a deteriorating of U.S.-China relations, we should turn this adversity into an opportunity for our community to think harder, what kind of a community we want to have, how we can help each other, really to build a compassionate society and a compassionate community, and how we can train and prepare and groom our next generations to be leaders in every aspect of our society. There's so much more, despite of all our progress and achievements, there's so much more for Chinese Americans to address our own problems. We have profound problems of our own, mostly derived from culture and history. Again, I want to say that I want to have everybody going home thinking one issue: why Indian Americans who came to this country much more recent and in a smaller number and from poorer countries only speak a little bit better English, can do so well, and they are the new Jews in this country. If you don't believe my words, you can turn on the CNN or even turn on the Fox News. You will see how many Indian Americans are there. If you look at this administration's appointment below the cabinet level, there are so many more Indians than Chinese, which, you know, everybody's looking at the cabinet level, right? I think, but it's actually interesting to have to study the totality of all the political appointees. And I can guarantee you that Indian Americans are doing so much better. Now, I'm saying this not to say that they don't deserve it. Indian Americans are wonderfully, highly achieving community, but just, I think that if we have a deep and careful study, and through their example, we can find out and actually pinpoint our weakness, which is, I think, actually a profound deficit in our community of a civic spirit, and therefore, because of that, lack of leadership. And that's our challenge. And I hope that in this decade, we will all step up and to be more civically engaged and to be politically engaged. We are in a very transitional period. We are making history by ourselves as we are talking about today. So let's all figure out how we can build a better, more compassionate Chinese American community. Thanks.
Thank you, Haipei. That's an excellent response and remarks on Futen's presentation of this landmark study. Questions are trickling in. Before we're going to address these questions from the audience, I have a couple of questions to pose to Futen first. So the first one is a simple one. That is, how long does this study take? Why did Committee of 100 give this project to a UK-based think tank, the Economist Intelligence Unit? So that's the first question. The second question is, Haipei just mentioned that the new census that was just completed last year may have the Chinese American population at 6 million. When he and I also came to the States in 1987, Haipei said there were only 1.2 million Chinese Americans here. So now either at 5.3 million or 6 million, is there a correlation between the growth of the Chinese American population and the discrimination that they're confronting today? Third question is I think the problem I have with this report, while recognizing this is a historic landmark study, that the report has not addressed the central issue facing all Chinese Americans, that is their political participation here in the US. How come it does not address the voting statistics of the Chinese Americans? Why not looking at their voting pattern? You did point out some of the Chinese American political leaders, politicians, from the first senator in Hawaii, to the recent cohort of Chinese American members of Congress. So these are the three quick questions, from simple to the more difficult ones. So go ahead, Futen.
Got it. Thank you, Yahweh. Yeah, appreciate the questions. Definitely came out straight from the get-go with these tough questions. And to answer some of them, in our process, and this was like a year plus long process, we spent a lot of time to determine which organization we wanted to go with. And we connected with multiple organizations who did this work. And we know of EIU that they have a great reputation, and they've done a lot of great work in terms of studies that's backed by data and a lot of impact studies. And so that's part of the reason why we were able to maintain that relationship with them. As for your second question, and I think Haipei touched on this very well, and it really goes to the core of our organization and our dual mission, one of which is to promote the full inclusion of Chinese Americans. And the second mission is to foster constructive relations between the US and China. And I think that that's something that is missing in terms of an understanding for the second generation Chinese Americans in connecting that correlation between Chinese Americans and the relationship between US-China and the experiences of the broader Asian American community. I think that we've seen in history that with 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and what we see today as geopolitics and tensions between US and China arises, even back then, what that looks like is a lot of increased tensions and discrimination faced on a day-to-day level across those who look like Chinese people. And nowadays, I think we really see that with everything going on with carriers of the disease seen as the labeling as the China virus. And so I hope that answers your second question. And in terms of the third question, what we wanted to do is, to Haipei's point, we wanted to be able to celebrate some of the contributions. So while we did address some of the challenges on a more broader level, the purpose of the study was to compile the contributions across these different sectors together. And we did acknowledge that while there have been great strides in representation in these positions along the way, there is a missing lack of representation in terms of voter engagement. And we really we really lean on folks in organizations such as AAPI Data, who have been doing this work in presenting these studies to really complement and address some of those challenges. And so for this project is more focusing on the contributions across the 175 plus years.
Thank you, Futin. So here is a question at the Q&A. It's anonymous. It's, I guess for both Futin and Haipei, the question is, what is the biggest challenge 2020 review for Chinese Americans to survive and thrive in this country? What are some of the immediate actions Chinese American community should take to address these challenges? A very good question, both of you.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Haipei can go ahead first.
Well, of course, I think we all would come to the same conclusion that the immediate problem we can think of as the most pressing one would be, I think, I will still put a lack of a civic engagement and a spirit as the most important one. But our second immediate one is the huge and still growing political divide among the Chinese Americans, which is very often so ugly, right? When Dr. Sun Yat-sen said the Chinese is a 一盘散沙, right? A plate of sand. I was saying that's a very beautiful place for Chinese to be, because today we are like brothers killing each other. It's much worse than 一盘散沙. And that has divided our society for the last 6 or 7 years. And on top of that, there's a new push among some people that's trying to make every one of us to take a stand on either you're pro-China or against China. These kind of things are very divisive. I don't think they should be put in the public square of the Chinese American society. They should be left to the individual conscience and individual life experience, and not to be kind of throw it down your mouth and make everybody line up either on this side or on that side, which is very detrimental to the future growth of society.
Futin?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is how we relate to our Chinese American identity and what that looks like in really tangible things such as civic engagement and among other issues, among participation, etc. I think that because, like as Haipei said, we come from so many different generations, different regions, different political backgrounds. There is a lot of diversity and folks coming from all these different places. And so there's often a lack of a unifying cry or, a unifying identity of what it means to be Chinese American. Like in the study, there's folks from across the country, across different generations, different even ethnic and racial backgrounds. There's Chinese Americans from areas like Peru and across the world even. And when it comes to identifying and getting more involved with your actual community and the broader American community, I think that because of that lack of connection, you do not see that results in actual tangible action. So it's encouraging to see that second generations in my peer group are getting more involved in supporting small businesses, seeing that their prior generations are struggling and to adapt in these COVID times. So that part is encouraging. We also want to encourage more folks to be able to turn that and then transition that to a more political and civic engagement focused area where they're calling on our legislator to provide more support. But as time and time again show, even with in history, with the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, with these mutual aid groups, I think we need to really encourage folks to first just be able to give back to the community to do something, And mutual aid, when it comes to that, it's really about just helping your peers in a very radical way. And I think that as we bridge that connection to yourself and to your Chinese American community and your identity, what you'll see is more action and more tangible things.
Thanks, Futan. We have two questions. I think one is for Futan and the other is probably more for Haipei. The one for Futan is, this is a very good study. I see the value of distributing the study among our community and communities outside Chinese Americans. Is there any program in place to push this effort? So this is the question for Futan. For Haipei is, it's good to see leaders of many Chinese American organizations here, Haipei being one representative. How these Chinese American grassroots organizations are going to coordinate their effort? Is there a initiative to get all these, as Haipei mentioned, they're all very much divided. You have Committee of 100, we have United Chinese Americans. Here in Georgia, we have one organization founded by long time ago, back in the 1970s, National Association of Chinese Americans, and then we have Organization of Chinese American, OCA, and there are so many of these organizations, and then we have S. Wu's 80-20 initiative. They're all there. They all appear to be working for the same interest of the Chinese Americans, but yet there's very little coordination. So that's the second question for Haipei. Why don't you go first, Futan, and then Haipei can think about that relatively big question that we all need to find an answer for.
I just want to say how great it is to be here together with you, Dr. Liu, and also with Haipei. Again, I just want to reiterate, I think it's so grateful to be together to also celebrate the Lunar New Year and to be able to be on this session with you. I think that it's very encouraging as a first step, and it's sort of answering the second question. But I also, as someone who's Chinese American, who really gravitate towards just the mission and mission-driven organizations for the community, I think that we need to see more organizations come together. And right now, we're trying to partner with orgs to answer that first question in terms of getting this into curriculum on a state-by-state level. And we're willing to work with folks here who are interested, as well as with Haipei, folks at UCA, and across other organizations to build this coalition out, to really advance and getting this part of history into our local educators and to our schools. I'll let Haipei answer the second question.
It is a very complicated question. I definitely don't have an easy and a short answer. Just want to give you one example. In this country, about 10 years ago, several, primarily I think 5 major Asian American civil rights organization or legal aid association from LA, San Francisco, Chicago, Atlanta, and Washington, DC, they formed a consortium or a common brand is called the AAAJ, Asian American Advancing Justice. Under that generalized umbrella, the 5 organizations still retains their own relative independence and doing their own budgeting and hiring and the program. So, and that is a huge progress in terms of the Asian American, especially on the political and civic engagement front. I'm hoping that some of that can come down to our Chinese American community. Actually, there are some coordinations and constant talk among the Chinese American organizations. UCA and C100 and OCA are in very regular talk, more than with other organizations, maybe partly because a lot of these are federal policy oriented groups. So we do have a lot of issues that we do not necessarily coordinate, but kind of trying to make everybody aware of the issues. And occasionally we do have joint actions. So yes, we need more of that. Maybe we need to come up with some more creative way to improve that. But more organization, there is actually a beauty for having more organizations. and that is every organization will try so much harder if there's only one without a competitive market. So that competition does sometimes do some good stuff on that. I want to come with one quick, this is apart from this, I'm just thinking about the issues. I use some big words that we, our community, relatively speaking, has a deficit or deep deficit of a civic spirit. And because of that, then we we have a problem with our leadership. Everybody come around to see that. Now, I just want to say that the leadership is not about the 做大官, right? Oh, you talk about political leadership, you got to run for public office. No, in every aspect of life, as long as you want to shape the society, either the bigger ones or the neighborhood, you want your view and your vision of what a society should be to be implemented, should be moving in that direction. That is leadership. And I think that maybe a little bit exaggerating that we, the Chinese American, has already earned the stomach of America by our fine restaurant. And we have to some extent earned the brain of this society because we are now the scientific and technological backbone of America. Seriously, the 6 million Chinese American has provided 1/3 of campus academics, of 1/3 of Silicon Valley engineers. These are amazing achievements. So we got the brain of this society, we got a stomach. The last thing we need to have is that this society is a heart, and the heart can be earned by our civic engagement leadership. And that's the last thing, the last mile we need to go. But we also know that last mile is often the hardest mile to cover. And thanks.
Right, the next question is a very interesting question. I think, Futon, in your presentation, you talked about Chinese Americans are very much divided in terms of their wealth. You know, the stereotype is probably crazy rich Asian Americans, that all Chinese Americans are rich. You know, they buy a lot of real estate. You know, they are able to pay tuition for their kids to go to Ivy League universities. So who are at the bottom of the Chinese Americans economically? The other related question is, did the study look into the so-called illegal immigrants from China, which may be less of a problem, but I remember in the late 1990s and first decade of 21st century, there are lots of illegal Chinese immigrants, you know, coming either from the sea or crossing the border from Mexico into the US. You know, do we have numbers of these illegal immigrant Chinese? Are they, what you say, at the bottom of the run as far as the entire Chinese American community is concerned? And Haipei, certainly you can contribute to the answer of that question, but Futon, please go.
Yeah, so to answer the second question first, I don't believe our report fully covers that portion of the Chinese American story and our journeys here. With the first question, I think that when we think of Chinese Americans who are in need of more support, I think that right now, with all the attacks happening across the country, an area of support needed, it would be the folks who are most vulnerable. That includes our seniors and those who are limited English proficient. And so because of that, those two groups, I think that the combination of that is going to resulting in folks who are having trouble to access the city services or the actual organizations that provide the support that's needed. I think that, yeah, I think in general, many folks do not know what's out there that can really provide support. And so those groups, I would say, are really, just groups that come to mind when it comes to folks at the bottom. And I can test that at New York City, where C100 we're based out of, the Asian Americans are among the, just the poorest in general out of the city with a 25% poverty rate. And if you just think about what you see on a day-to-day basis, you see many Chinese American seniors who are out on the streets collecting cans, and they're also the ones vulnerable and from being attacked.
But again, I think you haven't answered that question. Is who are these seniors? Are these seniors Chinese Americans who were born here, or are these seniors parents of first generation Americans like us? And who are out on the street picking trash, and who are these? Are these illegal immigrant Chinese, or I think we do need to get a better sense in terms of who these people are and what can be done.
Yeah, so like I said, the report provides an overview of the demographics. It's not really taking a look at too much of the challenges on a disaggregated level. I think that that's an argument to say that we need better data to understand our community. With COVID, just being able to understand data on a ethnicity by ethnicity level, that's something that's currently missing. And so at least in cities like New York City, Chinatown, with San Francisco, Chinatown, with the seniors who are based out of those areas, they're typically been multiple generations of seniors, like they're third, fourth, or fifth generation seniors who are citizens. At least I can attest to that on a personal level, but the report will not show that.
All right, Happy, you have.
Yeah, very quickly that 72% of Chinese Americans are first generation immigrants. And I would assume that our poor seniors are primarily from the first generation Chinese Americans. Very few of us are aware that actually Chinese American on welfare program has a higher percentage than the national average. Almost we're a little bit less than African American communities. So even if I think in general, our seniors, even if on poverty, have left a better life than African Americans, by legal standards, it's a huge amount of us are still living in poverty, especially during the senior years. And let alone, we also have to know that 400,000, and maybe who knows, maybe 500,000 Chinese Americans are illegal immigrants. And these people cannot have a very decent life, living the life like that. So we are I think we are clear where they come from primarily.
Thank you. One question I think is very interesting, both of you probably may have remarks on that, is one of the problems of Chinese Americans becoming politically active in the US is because of their Chineseness. Is it, should it be the focus that to make Chinese Americans more American than, trying to get them to preserve the so-called Chinese characteristic? Where should the focus be? I think the one stereotype about Chinese Americans is, from the other side is, Germans come to America, they become Americans. Italians come to America, they become Americans. Irish come to America, they become Americans. But Chinese come to America, they're always Chinese Americans. That hyphenated part is always going to be with them. It's not, it's chop suey. In other words, Chinese Americans never, according to some of the stereotype, never are able to be integrated into the mainstream. So the question here is, what should we focus on? And related to this is, what's the obstacle for the first generation Americans and then second generation Americans? Happy said Chinese Americans, 72% of them are first generation. So obviously they're facing different challenges here. So who would like to go first?
I will give it a try. This is something really very close to my heart. I guess the general answer is, I think for the first generation, we need to be much more trying to be Americans. And for the second generation and onward, I think actually we need to spend more effort to make them more Chinese. So it's a very specific answer for different groups on this issue. Yahweh, you mentioned the German Americans, and I would say that for German Americans and of course for Japanese Americans, if you ask their political leaders today, ask their community activists, they would all wish that they can be a little bit more Japanese American and it could be more German Americans. The Germans used to be a very proud people and a very rich and a vibrant culture in American society. And they are very regretting because of 2 world war and Germans has become bad guys in this society that for a lot of reasons, all that has left from the very proud German culture in this society. What do you remember? The answer is Oktoberfest. That's all there is for whatever German heritage there is. So, as America becomes such a first human experiment of a first globalized society, I think each ethnic community has a very unique role to play. I just want to say that, yes, for the first generation, we need to be really learning to be American, be more civic engaged, especially those kind of things. But you look at the Chinese culture and the Chinese heritage, there are something that I think we can truly contribute to this society. For example, our culture about trying to be thrift, which is actually very much in line with the environmental values today, right? Being thrift. And our value of harmony, which is very much could be a good antidote to the American political polarization of today. Every party today is crazily extreme. We do need that a little little dose of Chinese kind of in the middle, moderate, harmony can and should be into this a governing agenda. So there are a lot of things that I do think Chinese culture can, and at least within our own community, I hope that this is really my hope that our kids can be as American as your white neighbor's kids. But I hope your white neighbors will comment, in their own family to each other, say, look like this Chinese neighbor, their kids are wonderful, right? They are as American as our kids. However, their kids also have something more. They are so deferential, they're so respectful to the elders, the older people. I'm just an example giving this, right? It would be beautiful if we can train our kids to have that characteristic. So it's a very complicated story. I'd like to have a seminar someday on this topic separately.
That's great. I think we have one more question, and considering this is New Year's Eve here, we need to have a New Year banquet and feast. So I would like both of you to address this question posed by one of the audience. That is, Haipei mentioned Chinese Americans are sharply divided. I think they're also politically energized since 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, and then 2020 with the defeat of Donald Trump. So the audience, Snow Zhang, I think that's the name. He mentioned that we are Chinese Americans are divided because the American society is divided, big time. Secondly, we suffer from racial profiling, racial discrimination, and thirdly, there are also generation gaps between Chinese Americans. So in that context, how Chinese Americans as a group and Asian Americans as a whole, what we should do in the coming decade, to contribute to make this country a stronger, greater, better country, but also to make our community more protected, less discriminated against, and really becoming masters just as all other ethnic groups in the country. So it's a complicated question, but you get my point. Haipei will do the last. So Fudan, why don't you go first, and Haipei make the final concluding remarks.
Yeah, I would like to share. That's a great question, and it's one question that doesn't have a really doesn't come with a simple solution. I think it's important to have conversations like this and many more across different generations, different geographic locations and organizations to continue to process this. And I just want to emphasize the word process is because as Chinese Americans, myself as a second generation, I think that with our parents, when they sacrificed a lot to come to this country to seek better opportunities, there's a lot that was sacrificed in terms of our upbringing and how we relate to our identity. And so one way I would say in terms of generation is find ways to healthily, in a healthy way, process those emotions and those experiences and just take a look through your history and trace it back and seeing different elements and figuring out why things were the way they were there to understand more about yourself, where you're coming from. And I think that's something second generations really need to do more of. As Haipei said, we need to embrace a little bit more of that Chinese part of our identity. And you can really be fully both Chinese and you can be fully American. And in terms of how to come together in terms of civic issues, I think that it's okay that different folks identify across different political affiliation. In some ways that's somewhat healthy, but I don't think that extreme, being too extreme is good. I think there's always areas that we need to find common ground in. And one issue in New York City that I think that is good in terms of Chinese Americans should be coming together along with other communities that are non-Chinese, non-Asian, is experiences that are faced by delivery workers who are riding e-bikes. And I use that example, and it was referenced in a New York Times article written by Jay Caspian Kang as a very unique issue about transportation. And delivery workers, many of them who are Chinese, who are more on the older generation side, they experience really harsh days of work with very little pay. And these are the type of issues that Chinese Americans really come together to support in, because they're being penalized right now for riding certain bicycles that the mayor and the governor has not deemed legal, but they still need to make a living. So it's those types of issues that have an opportunity to come together in. And it's beyond just focusing on certain issues that Chinese Americans are keen on, such as education, such as what happens to us. We need to think greater and broader.
Thanks, Haipei. Before you answer the question, actually, I forgot to mention, Snow Zhang also mentioned, in addition to political division in the country among all Americans, racial discrimination against Chinese, generation gap, there's also what you mentioned before, that is China. Because, we all seem to be tainted by the rise of China, as if, if you are Chinese American, you're here to help China out. Therefore, you're going to be punished for that. So all these four factors to be considered, and how Chinese Americans are going to heal, and how we're going to make better contribution to the country we're citizens, but also to our groups. We're a special interest group people. We need to protect ourselves. So Haipei, the floor is all yours, and then we'll finish after you make your concluding remarks. Thank you.
Well, that's a large shoe fulfilling. I don't have a good answer on those questions. All I can think of is, I think we just need to learn to be a little bit more civil, a little bit more humble in our own views, a little bit more respectful to others. And we should start that from language. Our Chinese language, as is shown on WeChat, are really, really brutal. I haven't seen any other people's political debate is as brutal as our own communities. I think that, especially for mainland Chinese, there's so much more examples we can learn from around us. We don't need to say, oh, how great the Jewish people are. That's a little bit too far off. And we don't even need to say how great that Indian American has achieved. Let's just look at our own, like people from Hong Kong and Taiwan and Malaysia and Singapore, right? If you have contact with them in your life, we can see our deficits in our own civility, in our own lack of a civic spirit. Taiwanese American, or many of them are of Chinese descent. They are much smaller than the mainland Chinese first generation here now, but their leadership as shown in various aspects of government enterprises are way higher represented than our own, the mainland Chinese community. So these are very close and endearing example that we should pick up and learn. We cannot just say we come from China, we don't know about that, you know, everything is alien to us. We have been here for 20, 30, 40 years. We should have learned enough. We should keep our eyes wide open, how to engage each other, how to differ, you know, hold different opinions from each other. That we do have a very deep, profound lack of civility in that aspect. Now, so that's kind of my humble opinions on that. To end, I would say that this minority of 6 million Chinese Americans, we have to look at ourselves in a different way. We are being put in the most competitive society, which is America, and in a racially dominantly white society, and we survived. And many of us not just survived, we thrived. And so on that positive notes, we should really be proud of what our achievements are. I think we are not just a minority, we are a critical minority, meaning that Yahweh has mentioned about China. Think about China in the longer term. Think about China in 10 years, 20 years. Nobody knows what is the last chapter of China's history within the 10 or 20 years, right? It is an open-ended question. That this tiny minority, 6 million, we are actually a bridge of the two most powerful countries and civilizations that will shape the 21st century. What a wonderful role that's being put on our shoulders, you know, right? If you're Nigerian American, if you are, you know, Malaysian American, you don't even have that blessing to be that critically important. So I think we should never forget that we can be that bridge community, that critical minority that can make a difference in our own community and the larger society. Thanks.
I think your concluding remarks are really great. That is the role Chinese Americans are going to play. This is not just a patriotic duty of all of us, you know, it's epic that the fact that we can bridge, you know, two most important economically, politically countries together, both culturally and strategically, then, you know, that's a mission. I think, you know, that will be recorded in this world history. So, you know, I think we should all be proud of ourselves occupying that position. But at the same time, we all also have to be bona fide, patriotic, loyal Americans so that we can become honest brokers of the two countries. On that note, I want to thank Committee of 100 for the landmark study. Thank Fu and Ho for the excellent presentation of the study, and thank Haipei for your brilliant analysis of the situation and your quote unquote humble recommendation in terms of what we Chinese Americans can do. I also want to say Happy New Year to all the audience, to everyone through you, to all your families and friends. Goodbye. Bye-bye.